Why it doesn't stay?
I tried pulling it really far down. Well, no. Unfortunately, there's another.
Oh, yeah, that's a hook.
Loop.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's not quite part of.
So we can use that.
Good.
Okay, I think we're good to go.
Okay. Okay, yes. About the.
And then I'll just move this so people can hear you.
Sure. And I'll go all the way up here. No, I think it's disconnected.
Wait, what just happened?
I don't know. Oh,
There.
okay. Okay, so how can I go to the first slide?
If you just go right back.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, we're live on the Google Hangouts, and I'm David Smith, who is being who's doing a bad job of being host and scheduling several events now on top of the same thing. But thank you very much for coming over to Northeastern, where there are a lot of people who work on network analysis and spatial analysis on GIS. So this is a very interesting talk to us. And I'm so very happy to have Song Chen, who received his PhD from Harvard in 2011. He's now back visiting after also being a professor of Chinese history at Bucknell University in lovely central Pennsylvania, where I'm from originally, lower down the Susquehanna Valley. And he's going to talk about using spatial analysis and network analysis of the biographies of members of the Chinese elite, primarily in the 11th century, and has a lot of experience connecting all of the messy data that you get out of text to the kind of clean data that people perhaps in more modern social network analyses are used to working with. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It is my great pleasure to be here in the first week of spring in Boston, probably I should say the last week of winter in Boston, to share my work and my thoughts on digital methods and its relationship to Chinese history studies or the humanities field in general with like-minded scholars. So the title of my talk is from text to data to visuals, computational methods and the study of the Chinese political elite. Right. So here's what I'm going to talk about. So as I was preparing for this talk, I come up with a few questions I think that might be of interest to the audience in general. So here are my questions. What can digital methods do for us as humanists, as literary scholars, as digital classists, or as historians? Why do we care? How do we do it? And what are the challenges and how should we meet those challenges? I will try to address these questions in my talk, but I will not attempt to address these questions one by one separately, because I don't think it is a good way to do it. To do it that way, I think the reason is that these questions, I think, are to a large extent related to each other and cannot be addressed separately. Now, for example, we can't really talk about why do we care without really talking about the concrete research findings which digital methods has helped us achieve. We cannot really talk about how we do history with digital methods without actually also talking about the challenges we're facing and the ways in which we address those challenges, right? So I think the best way for me to answer these questions is to first present you with a bunch of actual results that I have achieved with digital methods and applying digital methods to the study of Chinese history. And then as an afterthought, I will reflect upon these findings in general to offer you some of my thoughts on digital methods and the benefits and the weaknesses of digital methods in the use of Chinese in the study of Chinese history in more abstract terms. So my research tried to understand the ways in which the conquerors of China from the 10th century to the 13th century rebuilt a unified state, or an empire, you might call it, over large expanse of territory, pretty much the size of the modern European continent, under the new historical circumstances, and the social political consequences of those decisions that these people made in the 10th or 10th, 11th, 12th century of what we call the Song dynasty. So the Tang dynasty is one of the major dynasties in Chinese history, which ruled China from the 7th century all the way till the early 10th century, and it collapsed, and there was a period of 50 years in which different parts of China were ruled by different original states until the mid-10th century, when all these different states were conquered by the founders of the Song dynasty, and the Song dynasty to some extent ruled until the 13th century, at least in the southern part of China. So, but the Song people actually faced a very different historical circumstances, very different historical circumstances. By very different historical circumstances, I'm talking about the set of changes, the set of profound changes that took place between the Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty, sometimes referred to by historians as the Tang-Song transition. It was characterized by relaxed state control over commerce. The Tang capital city, for example, was a grid system strictly controlled by the state. The commercial activities took place in designated areas, and these areas were walled and supervised by government officials. But the Song city was like this, right? The Song capital city is so this is a 12th century painting reflecting upon the urban scene of the Song capital. We see a lot of hustling and bustling stuff going on here. We see different buildings and so on, boats, transportation. So it is a very commercial, it's a period characterized by commercialization and monetization. Money supply increased dramatically. And in fact, there was also the manuscripts. The Tang people, when they were reading books, they were largely reading manuscripts. By the Song time, the spread of printing, wood block printing, and sometimes metal block printing, have actually made books and knowledge easily and cheaply available, relatively cheaply available to a larger segment of population. Now, we're also talking about many other issues, relaxed controls, for example, on the land market. We are talking about the changing government institutions, the rise, the expansion and the growing political importance of the new civil service examination system, and the new government revenues that relied as much on commercial taxes as on land taxes. The agricultural increase in agricultural productivity, new military system that relied on the new government revenues, and one of the most dramatic thing was the growth of population from the 7th century to the 13th century. The population in China almost doubled, right? So, so we're talking about the period when all these different changes are taking place. The population growth, increasing agricultural productivity, new government institutions, new military setup, and so on and so forth. But I think there's something that is missing from this picture, which is talked about, but not very often, which is the spatial dimension of all of these changes. For example, population change, right? We see population doubled over these centuries, but it was not that population doubled everywhere on the land governed by the Tang or the Song dynasty. In fact, we see significant variance across different regions. In the north, there was a net drop. There was a net decrease in the population. For much of North China, population remained more or less stable. It was the south that gained population. In many different parts of China, population increased by 4 times, 5 times, even by 1,000%. Okay? So we are looking at a very different configuration of space. And also, when we're thinking about the government, we are no longer.
Question. What time frame is this change?
Yes, it's from the 7th century, 600 to 1300.
Okay.
And this is the sort of old map that I copied from a book, so it meant to be extremely accurate.
Right. And then is this the registered or the estimated real?
They are estimates based on registered households.
Okay.
Right. So the other thing, I think the spatial dimension of the discussion is also missing from our discussion of the change in the government structure. We're talking about new government institutions. We're talking about new fiscal institutions. We're talking about new military institutions. But we know that the state existed in space, right? And especially for this period, the Song dynasty or the Tang dynasty were trying to govern a vast expanse of territory under pre-modern technological conditions. So how did they do that? How did the state configure the relationship between different places, different regions? In fact, there is some discussion from the Tang dynasty. If we look at the Tang dynasty, 7th century, 8th century metropolitan examination graduates, we see that most of the people were actually from the northern part of China, where the Tang capital city was located. And in fact, there was a recent book that just came out, I think, last year, which talked about the 9th century political elite. And the argument was that up until the 9th century, just a few decades right before the Tang dynasty collapsed, the vast majority, almost all, in fact, the entire national political elite of the Tang dynasty were based in the Tang capital regions of North China. And how did that change? Or did that change at all in the Song dynasty? Did the Song political elite, the composition of the geographical composition of the Song elite, reflect these changes in population growth, in the changing configuration of wealth and commerce in this period? Well, so this is one of the projects I just completed about a few months ago, which is, so I'm looking at the prefects. So the Song dynasty had several hundreds of prefects at each time, and each prefect was governed by a governor, right? And also a vice governor. But here I'm looking at the prefectural governors. I'm looking at where the prefectural governors were from. Instead of looking at the entire Song dynasty as a pilot project, I'm looking at the 10 years from 1040 to 1049. And I mapped them on the Song dynasty map down to the prefectural level, and ask the question, where did these prefectural governors from the 1040s from? Like this. To some extent, I think it confirms it sort of confirms our understanding, the hypothesis that the north, the capital regions, no longer dominated the political power as much as it did in the previous centuries. We see pockets of success in the southern part of China, but we don't see a clear pattern here. We would say some sort of pockets of success along the southeast coast, and some success along this area, which is the Gan River Basin in modern Jiangxi province, and some success along the Tai Lake area in lower Yangtze Delta. But on the other hand, it still shows that the north, especially the capital regions, the Song capital of Kaifeng and Henan, which is modern-day Luoyang, remain the places that produce where most of the prefects were from. Okay? And then I looked at a different set of data. And these are prefects from the early 13th century, people who hold prefectural governorship from 1210 to 1219. And here we see a very different picture. And of course, by this time, the Song dynasty had lost North China. So to some extent, it doesn't surprise us that no governors were from the northern part of China. But the new capital was in this area, in the modern Hangzhou, in modern-day Hangzhou. What is interesting is not just that the prefects came predominantly from the southeastern part of China, but what was interesting was that even in the southeastern part of China, the prefecture that produced the largest number of prefectural governors in this period was not the metropolitan prefecture where the capital was located. So in other words, so the capital was here, but it produced a moderate number of prefectural governors in this period. The most successful prefecture was actually here. And if we look at the distribution of these prefecture-producing prefectures in this period, we actually see these the most successful prefectures formed a continuous stretch along the East China coast, the Southeast China, the coast of Southeast China. Right? What I think this suggests is that political power was no longer dominated by a small number of the elite dwelling in the capital areas, but instead were shared with people who are living in multiple different prefectures that enjoyed enormous economic success through commerce and international trade. Right? These became the most economically successful areas during this period. And here, I look at a different question. So I'm asking about, okay, so we have this political elite. So assume we have this, so this is the political elite that we have from the mid-11th century and early 13th century. To what extent were they well connected to each other? So here, I'm looking at their marriage networks, their kinship networks, including their marriage networks, as well as their agnatic relationships. So the solid lines the thick solid lines are agnatic networks. The thin solid lines represents marriage networks, and the dotted lines represent marriage. So the dotted lines connects two dots, two prefectural governors who are related to each other through marriage to the same third party, right? So and the different colors represents the different native places where these people were from, and what were so we still need to do some more analysis about this. But from the spaghetti ball we have right now, it seems very clear that the vast majority of the prefectural governors from the 11th century were actually related to each other in one way or another, right? And we see a lot of it, especially we see a lot of blue dots and orange dots here. The blue dots are people from the North China, and the orange dots are people from Southeast China. And if we look at the 13th century, it was a totally different picture. The giant component where almost every prefectural governor was a participant in disintegrated. So we see the networks actually sort of broke up into different small groups of prefects. So the kind of integration, the kind of close relationship between prefectural governors, among the political elite in the mid-11th century was disappearing from this image. Right? So now, let's move on to a different topic, and let's ask these questions in a different way. Instead of taking two time slices on the national level, let us look at focus on one place and look at how this place changed, how political relationship between this place and the central government changed over the course of 300 years in the Song dynasty. And here, we're looking at the four circuits of Sichuan, which is in the southwestern part of China, bordering Tibet, which is here. And it's the farmost sort of, the furthermost western frontier of the Song Empire. And in this map, we're asking the question, where did those officials posted to Sichuan come from? And I'm looking at the period, about the first century of the Song dynasty, from 960 all the way to 1040. And we see the vast majority of them were from North China, and especially the capital regions, the Henan and Kaifeng. But if we fast forward to the late 12th century and the 13th century, looking at the period from 1128 to 1279, we see a very different picture. Of course, the court had relocated to the to the south during this period, losing the northern part of the territory to the invading Jurchens. So we are not expecting to see a lot of the people who claim the northern ancestry from this period. But still, Southeast China, which dominated the sort of the political scene this period, did not produce as many officials in Sichuan as the Sichuan men themselves. Vast majority of those people holding prefectural governorships, vice governorships, county magistracy, and other circuit or serving as circuit officials were coming from Sichuan itself, especially the Chengdu Plain on the western part of Sichuan. Now, so we add two maps between 1041 and 1127 to show the changes for the entire 300 years, and we see this change sort of took place somewhere between in the late 11th century, right? So the change took place. So here in up until the late 11th century, we see pretty much the same pattern sort of persisted. And why did this happen? Well, I do have explanations, but I don't think I want to go into that. But the explanations cannot be gained from looking at the maps. The maps show you a pattern, but the maps do not explain those patterns. And it might suggest some hypothesis, but that kind of hypothesis is something that you need to test, is something that the conclusions are something that you need to draw from more careful textual studies. Now, so if in the 13th century, most of the people who served in Sichuan were from Sichuan itself, right? So that means a lot of the Sichuan men were actually recruited into government as members of the political elite. So how can we trace their career paths? Can we trace the life of these people? Well, I think we can, because we have a lot of very rich biographical data on many of these people, and we can reconstruct their career paths based on those biographical materials. So here I'm going to show you a small video, which is, well, how can I do that?
If you just drag the whole keynote over a little bit.
Oh,
just click on the window.
I click on the window.
Yeah, and then drag it like up in the gray part.
Okay, so
Just the
Mac is difficult for me.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, I see.
This is it.
Oh, yes, right. So here we see, here is the period. So we're animating the career paths of people, of the Sichuan-born officials over the course of the 300 years of the Song Dynasty. And these lines, so the starting point or end point of each line suggests a new position. And so these are directed lines, which suggests a earlier position, which was followed by a newer position, a new appointment, which is the end line of the line. So the color of the lines suggests appointments to local or court positions. So the red lines are represent the appointment to court positions, and the black lines represents a line to the black lines represent appointments to local positions. So if we run the slide, when we see some clear patterns over the course of 300 years. We start in the late 10th century when we see that most of the appointments of the Sichuan-born officials were largely outside the different circuits of Sichuan, in the capital areas in North China or in the vast south. And sometimes, gradually in the 11th century, these appointments are combined with some appointments in Sichuan. But it's pretty much a national. It's a rotation on a nationwide scale. But once we get into the late 11th century, and especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, things begin to change. We see many of these people spend most of their career in Sichuan itself, so with the exception of a few court appointments to the capital areas. And this pattern began to reveal itself in the late 11th century, and we see more and more after the court moved to the south in the 12th century. So these long lines usually suggest appointments to court positions in the capital areas. Very few of the Sichuan men served in outside Sichuan and also outside the capital. So in the so that will be the 13th century. And things began to change a little bit after the 1230s because the Mongols attacked and some of the Sichuan men moved out of Sichuan. But we're not going to show that part of the data here. So, okay, so let me get back to my slides. Okay, I think now I can know how to do it. Okay, and when play. Okay, so these are the animation is a good way. If we are not clear about how we're going to paradise this 300 years, the animation is a good way for us to explore the data, and then we decide on how to break our data into different time slices, right? So after doing the animation, we can actually produce 4 sort of static maps, right, for 4 different periods of the Song dynasty again. So then the first will be, so the first 2 maps are the first 100 years of the Song dynasty. Very few Sichuan men were actually recruited into court, so we have very few data points. But we can see their appointments they were posted all across the Song dynasty. But starting from the late 11th century, and especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, we see most of these people served predominantly within the Sichuan area itself. Okay. How did this change their marriage patterns? Right? What are the political? So what do we have seen is basically a new sort of a governing strategy, which features the recruitment of the local men, and then the employment of these local men as local officials in not necessarily in their hometowns, but very close to their hometowns. Now, how did these political decisions change the social behavior of these people? Well, we're looking at the marriage patterns here. So here is the marriage pattern of the Sichuan-born officials in the first 80 years of the Song dynasty. And we see lots of long-distance marriages, right, between men from Sichuan and elsewhere in different other parts of China. But very few marriages between different between Sichuan men from different prefectures within Sichuan itself. And this actually changed again in the 12th century. By 12th century, we see a lot of marriages going on here. So the thick lines, thick lines represents more instances of marriage between official families from these 2 different prefectures, and each dot represents a prefecture, and the size of the dot represents the number of intra-prefectural marriages between the official families residing in the same prefecture. So we cannot represent that these marriages with a line. So I'm representing them with the size of the dot. And in fact, we see very few marriages going on between the Sichuan men and people from elsewhere, other parts of China. And if we zoom, and we can also ask a different question. So with a lot of people, with a lot of Sichuan recruited in, their behavior changed before and after their recruitment into civil service, right? And so here we're focusing just at on the Sichuan areas, and here we're looking at the marriage networks of the non-official families from the Song, from the non-official families in Sichuan during this entire period of the Song dynasty. And we see these big dots here, which basically represents local marriages, right? So many of these people were marrying with other families from the same county and from the same prefecture. Lines between different prefectures suggest the marriage across prefectural borders. There are some, but compared to the marriage of official families, there were very few. The official families tended to marry more often and more frequently across the prefectural boundaries and across a vast territory. Usually, so some of these lines represent a distance of several hundred miles. So here I think is the time for us to reflect upon some of the questions, right? What can digital methods do for us, and why do we care? Well, we can see it helps us ask new questions and answer old questions in a very different way with a very different degree of efficiency, right? Early on, when people were doing history, we tend to focus on the big names, right? Wang Anshi, a famous politician from the 11th century, Li Bai, a famous poet from the 8th century, Zhu Xi, a famous thinker from the late 12th and early 13th century. And of course, we continue to be interested by these people because they left a significant influence on Chinese history. But at the same time, we could, in fact, expand our research to many of the other less well-known people to understand, to look at not one person or two persons, but look at lots of different officials who served in different parts of China at different levels during that period, and ask what is their shared pattern of behavior? How did their shared pattern of behavior change? And that is what we call prosopography, right? Prosopography is not a new term, it's a pretty old term, but computational methods just allow us to do this far more easier, in a way that is far more easier than ever before. Digital methods help us do this because it allows us to manipulate our data sets in a more efficient way, and to manipulate large data sets in a more efficient way. But it also helps us do this because it can visualize things. It can visualize the career patterns. It can visualize the network patterns. We historians tend to work with our minds and then speak out our minds or put them down on paper. Right? We look at the text, we think about it, we come up with the argument, we talk to people, or we write it down. We're not trained to visualize things. But to some extent, I agree that our minds are powerful and our language is powerful. Our language is powerful to the extent that for the past thousands of years, it allowed us to communicate our ideas to other people, allowed knowledge to be accumulated over generations, allowed civilization to flourish. But on the other hand, I think we also need to recognize that our language is linear and it has certain limitations. Suppose, for example, okay, so this is the map of the Qing dynasty, which is colored by the pink areas. So let us suppose if we shut our eyes and so if half of the people here shut their eyes and the other half of the people here look at the map and then try to describe the territory of the Qing dynasty to the other half of the people who did not see this map, it will be very, very difficult. And here we're looking at the the Zhou dynasty. If we compare this and the Qing dynasty and talk about how different the territory of these two dynasties were, it'll be even more difficult because we're not just describing the spatial patterns, but also adding a new dimension, which is the temporal dimension. We're trying to describe spatial change. Describing spatial patterns, describing images, describing spatial change, the change of these images over a period of time is tremendously difficult, I think, for us to do verbally. Graphs are different. Graphs are multidimensional, and animations are multidimensional, even more multidimensional by bringing this new dimension of time. It allows us to mobilize our different aspects of our perceiving capabilities all at a time. The ways to conceptualize different patterns, the way to structural patterns, spatial patterns, and temporal patterns, and try to understand what was going on and generate hypotheses and test some of the hypotheses we might have. So when I was presenting this talk to some people, right? So in my casual conversations, some people would say, "Well, wow, that's great. That's big data." What I absolutely don't object that to that term, because I think it's the fashion of the day. It probably will help my projects get funded. But on the other hand, to some extent, I would say, well, yes, it is big data, but our biggest challenge is also data. For people who are really working with big data these days, their data comes from social media or some statistical bureaus. They are well formatted, but we are not. We are living in the age. We are working with texts, right? So these are biographies, tomb inscriptions, in fact, which give us the data, which I used for the previous visualizations, the maps and the network graphs. It contains various sorts of information: names of the subjects, their native places, the legends of the family's migration path, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, their sons and daughters, sites of burial, the examinations they took, the year in which they received the metropolitan degrees, and the career and their careers, the various kinds of official appointments that they received. Right? A lot of this are becoming available as searchable full-text databases. For some people, for certain kinds of research projects, these full-text searchable databases are data. Maybe for some literary scholars, that's true. But for me, for the kind of visualizations that I did, for the kinds of research questions that I'm asking, this is not quite data. We have to get the data out of these texts. So they are visualizing these texts, right? So they are also they OCR them, making them, turning them into full text searchable databases. We have lots of them, right? So the question is how to do it. Now, one way is to, so that actually involves a number of different steps. Regular expressions seem to be a very powerful tool to do that. And we actually have to first come up with the pattern. We come up with the dictionary, come up with a pattern, and try to identify the named entities in the text. So here is an example, which is the Chinese expression of the year in these historical texts, which combines which is composed of a rain title followed by a Chinese number and Chinese character of the year and the Chinese character for died. So these are texts that shows that gives us information about the date when the subject of biography died. Right? So we're looking at these. So we're constructing these patterns, and we're making use of a dictionary that lists all the Chinese rain titles in order to capture these expressions. And once you can do that, we can create something like this. It will be XML markup. This is something I'm still working on. So this is a biography, a tomb biography, in which I'm capturing the references to local offices, and which consists of an office title and the place that these people were appointed. And then once I have this structured XML data, I can put them into an Excel spreadsheet, which then can be coded and analyzed. We're building these relational databases. So we are integrating these bits and bits of data together so we can do cross searches. Right? So for the China biographical database is something I don't want to go into, but it offers a very interesting model for us to deal with historical data. And so here's the map we have just a symbol for. And the way in which I generate this map, right, is to go to a relational database. To first find out all the people who served in particular offices through by looking at their main data based on by looking at their postings data, which gives us the start year and the end year and the offices they held, and I pull out the places where they were posted and the places where they served. Right? Or if I want, and then I can combine this with the ArcGIS, which gives the XY coordinates, the longitudes and latitudes for these places, and put them in in a map and generate a map. Or an animation. Or for these network graphs, same thing. I'm making use of different tables in the database by looking first at pull out a bunch of people who served as prefectural governors and find out the places they were from, and also go to the kinship table to find out all those people who were their relatives. And we go back, and so these people are also stored in the main data table. So we can use their person IDs to find out their native places. So we can do this again and again. In fact, we have to do a number of loops in order to capture all the relatives mentioned by a person. So here is an example of part of that data. For example, I'm looking at a person called Shendu. I'm looking for his relatives, and I have to find his son's daughter's husband, which is a grandson-in-law, and then his father and his father's father, and so on, in order to construct the relationship between two people and calculate the distance between these people based on the kind of relationship we have captured in the database. So then we can put them into Netrol or Gephi or ArcGIS to generate a network graph or a network graph on the map. This is in fact a student work who's taking my course this semester, and he's visualizing friendship networks in the Song Dynasty. So I think what we're trying to do here is that we start with texts, right? And then we mark up certain parts of the text and put them into a relational database that allow us to access these data from multiple points of access. And then we generate network graphs or maps or a combination of both. And then we generate hypotheses. We test our hypothesis by going back to our text to read our texts, bringing more texts, or maybe doing some mathematical models, and eventually generate an argument. And I think what this suggests is that we are having a totally new way of doing research. Instead of going from text to arguments and back to text and back to arguments, we are having this intermediary step here, which is that we have to go from a text to data and to visualization, and then we go back to text and probably more data and more visualization, and eventually we come up with an argument. And I think I'm going to stop here and open the floor to questions.
Okay, I'm gonna go first. I don't know if you have a lot of questions.
Can I use your computer to
Sure.
those online questions?
Sure. So first, let me say that's an inspired talk you gave, and I'm impressed by all the work that went into it. You really got a lot of analysis in here, and yeah. So I have a bunch of questions.
Okay, great.
I'm gonna try to
Great.
select a few. So first of all, maybe I'll start with something about the content you presented, and then go into some more technical questions. First, I'd be interested if you have a hypothesis as to the reason for the different rates of population growth. So you showed there's a much higher population growth in the south, and so I'd be interested whether you think that is migration patterns or whether conditions there were different. What do you have any?
Well, it was a combination of both. In fact, I think this has been well studied in the existing scholarship for many years. It has something to do with the migration, because when the Tang Dynasty collapsed, the northern part of China was politically unstable, and there was a lot of civil war going on there. So a lot of people fled south. But on the other hand, I think it was also an economic phenomenon, because the south was warmer, and during this period, the early ripening variety of rice was introduced from Champa to the southern part of China. So instead of having one harvest every year, you can have 2 and even sometimes 3 harvests every year. Agricultural technology also improved, so this actually could support a lot more people than ever before.
Do you have any plan to ask questions like this with your data, or do you see any possibility to do that?
Of course they are, but it requires a very different kinds of data, right? Right now we're looking. I'm looking at the biographical data. Some of these data are harvested by myself, and some of these data are harvested by the people who are working on the China biographical database. And these data are mostly, especially for this period, on the elite population. Right? But we're looking at the population in general and its relationship to economic growth and so on, that we need data on economy, on taxation, and so on and so forth. And that will be a very different type of data. I don't have plan to take on that challenge at this moment, but who knows about the future?
Yeah. Which brings up another point I would have made. I think your work is a good example of matching the data you have and the feature you select with the kinds of question you ask. So in a lot of cases, you see people struggling with that. And I'm pretty happy and impressed with what I see in your work, that it's actually asking the right question on the right kind of data. I would add to that a note of caution with respect to the last point you made about going from text and analysis versus text and data and visualization and analysis, where I absolutely agree. I really like using our methods and visualizations to try to find patterns that the mind can't easily pass. And I think I don't need to tell you this. I think you will absolutely agree that each of these steps adds another source for wrongful analysis or for errors that we make. So say, for example, you use these regular expressions, and there's no saying that maybe they miss something or misrepresent something. I would probably expect the former rather than the latter. But there's always a source for that, a bias in your data, if you will. And I'm sure you agree with that and take that into account.
Right, of course. On the one hand, we have data integrity, right? So when you're transmitting data, especially when you're doing that on the semi-automated basis, if you're transmitting data from texts into text databases, there could be errors, right? And we try to find data sets where the error rate is low. And usually I employ different kinds of methods to test the data I have. For example, if I pull out 2 people from the databases who are father and who have this father, so one is a father, the other is a record as a son. So I try to pull out the official, the dates on their official appointments, and try to calculate this the difference in terms of their dates of appointment. If their father's on the dates of appointment, it shouldn't be more than maybe 20 years or 30 years, right? If there's 100 years,
right, and
then there's a problem, right? So we have to do this every time we are dealing with the data. On the other hand, I think there are 2 issues which are more important that people sometimes don't pay attention to. One is disambiguation. When a text or our language is not always very accurate. So sometimes, for example, this person said, oh, okay, so he served, for example, in the southern part of China. So the southern part of China is big, right? But in other cases, the language was very precise. So for those cases where language was not precise, how are you going to do that with the data? That involves a lot of judgment. The other thing is that when we're working with data, it tends to give us the false impression that we're accurate, we're unambiguous, we are scientific. But in fact, our data comes from the texts. It contains the same bias that our texts contain, right? So to some extent, I think we should be aware of the fact that our data, to some extent, duplicates the biases that are already inherent in our texts.
Precisely. I would have two more questions, and then I give you the check. So you're using biographical data, and I think you already answered that question in a way when you showed that what's now in the upper left corner, this page with and showed that there's segments of data relating to the biographies. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how is that the only method you use, and how you came about using that. So is your data uniform in a way that you can extract the biographies with this method, or do you use different methods? And in addition to that, I would point you to my colleagues at the DARIA consortium in Germany. They are focusing on extraction of biographies right now. So right now they're working on Wikipedia, and so what they do is that they try to extract structured representations of biographies. And so I'd be interested to hear how you go about that.
Right. It's in fact that's a challenge, right? That's a challenge, and partly because we're also dealing with Chinese texts over a course of several hundred years. So I mentioned the China Biographical Database, but I did not have time to go into that. The China Biographical Database is a collaborative project. It is under the leadership of Peter Ball at Harvard, but it involves a lot of participants across the globe, including myself. What we have been doing is to build a relational database, but at the same time, we need to capture data first from the Chinese historical texts. So for many years, Harvard had been, Peter Ball at Harvard and a group of faculty members and graduate students from both the East Asian Languages Civilizations Department and the Computer Sciences Department have been collaborating with each other in developing these computational programs in order to extract the data. The challenge is that, it turns out, well, first of all, we had a very good success rate when we're dealing with a certain corpus. But when we move on to a different corpus with a different genre, different style of writing, and the challenge was still great. So they have been working with short biographies and biographies in dynastic histories. And we have more than 5,000 lengthy, elaborate tomb biographies for this period that are available as a full text database, searchable databases. So I've been using about 500 of them. And my goal is that I would collaborate with some computer scientists and to customize, recycle some of the codes they have, but I believe at various points we have to write our own codes based on similar logics in order to capture data from these biographical texts. And these could be an independent database that can be used for visualization or for historical studies, and it could also be reformatted and incorporated into this larger China Biographical Database project.
Yeah. After the talk, I will give you the contact information.
Yes, I'll appreciate it.
They are really interested in expanding their collaboration over the DARIA network, and they have some funding to invite scholars. So I'll give you the address, and then you can see if you're interested in that kind of work.
Right, that'll be great.
I think I'll let Stella ask questions if she has any, and Otherwise, I'd be happy to go on.
I have a couple questions, but you can ask.
Oh, well, I'm gonna channel Greg Crane, who unfortunately can't be with us today, and he's always asking about the data background, what kind of data. So I'd be interested to hear about the source of your data, and the licensing most of all. So I don't know if how well you know him. He's a big advocate. You with the Perseus Digital Library of openly available data, and so I'm sure he'd be curious to hear what licensing your data has.
So a lot of these visualizations are from the China Biographical Databases. The China Biographical Database is the copyright, I think, is with Harvard, but it's free for everybody to use and download the data. It's freely available, and it's our goal to make it freely available to everybody as long as possible. Some of the other data were based on my dissertation research. They're from the tomb biographies that I've collected, from printed historical sources, archaeological reports, and various other kinds of sources. And we are also the China Biographical Database draws its own data from published sources. And because it's not reproducing, for example, a book, but simply extracting certain kinds of data from that book. So to that extent, it didn't have any licensing problems. When you do need a large corpus of full texts, large corpus of texts, for a long time they've been collaborating with the Academia Sinica in Taiwan, which has copyright, which owns the copyright over these digital texts, and they're willing to share. But I do think, in the long run, when we're trying to process more texts, licensing is a big problem. Many of these digital texts are based on historical texts, and the copyright law, I think, varies from country to country. I think in China, the person who digitized the texts owns the copyright, and some of these are academic institutions, and some of them are commercial publishers. We have to hope that eventually they will agree that we can use their data for text mining purposes without publishing the full texts.
Yeah, so his point, still channeling Greg Crane here, his point is often that in order to move, we're using these quantitative methods, and in order to move to a reproducibility like we have in the quantitative sciences, we need these open data, so that if someone runs an algorithm on a body of text and publishes their data, someone else could run that same or different algorithm on the same kind of data and then compare that. I think that's his main concern, besides some other issues about the accessibility of culture.
Right. I think it also it makes a lot of sense for people who are publishing this kind of studies to also publishing the particular set of data they're using for these studies, so other people can test the hypothesis. And we have already seen some good examples in this regard. I think some of the publishers who published the prosopographical studies on Chinese history last year agreed to also publish the access, the data in the format of the Microsoft Access database on the publisher's website, which you can freely download.
Last question before I let you go. How happy are you with OCR on these pages? Does it work pretty well? What's your experience?
I don't do the OCRs, so I make use of the full text, the text that are already available.
Yeah.
Because OCRs are not 100% accurate, right? The success rate depends. So whenever you run the OCR, you have to have somebody to check the OCR, which requires a lot of human resources and financial resources that I don't have access to. But the China Biographical Database project itself are doing the OCR. They are so we are still in this sort of on the early. We're still the China Biographical project database project is still sort of at the early stage of doing the OCR, dealing with OCR. As far as I know, they have identified a relatively good OCR software for Chinese texts, and it really depends on the quality of your scanned images. So they have access to some of the very high solution scanners, high speed scanners at Harvard. So instead of downloading scanned pages from certain websites, they are doing the scanning themselves. So they ensure that they have high quality images which they can apply the OCR onto, and they will have graduate students and undergraduate students in this country or in China sample check some of these images with the texts. And they are still doing that. I think it's going to be successful.
Great. I want to invite you to look at our open philology. I'm going to give you the website because we are building up a process to digitize on a large scale. And you might be interested, or we might be interested to work with one another.
Sure. I'll be glad to expand my my project to as many fields as possible.
Great.
I think it's important, right? It's for digital scholars, for digital humanists, it is extremely important for us to talk to each other, to share ideas, and to share our data as well.
I have fewer questions, but
which is great.
Unfortunately, I know. First of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. It really was wonderful. Unfortunately, I know pretty much nothing about this period in Chinese history other than what you just told us. So excuse my ignorance, but I was wondering, and this has implications for some of the data loss that Frederick was talking about. I was wondering if there's any renaming of people that goes on, especially with all of this changing of positions and possibly getting court positions. Can you count on or are there multiple names for one person on these tombstones, or is it a pretty reliable string for each, in computational terms, for each person?
Right. In fact, it may cause in two different. This goes in two different ways.
Yeah.
On the one hand, a person might be known by multiple different names, and at the same time, the same name might refer to multiple different people.
Yeah.
Right, and it's a standard practice for a Chinese man and Chinese woman in the pre-modern period to have multiple names.
Mm-hmm.
There are many names. They have they have their personal name, they have their courtesy or capping name, or they have in their style literally. They have their stylish literary name. They have their posthumous titles sometimes, and so on and so forth. What the good thing is that when most of the people we're dealing with are the political or social elites, and we have relatively complete biographies on them, and these biographies follow the convention of recording all of their names. So that is usually not a problem for us. The biggest problem for us is that when we encounter a person, when we encounter a name, and that name, if we know from historical sources, several people share the same name. And how can we identify whether this name refers to this person or that person mentioned in the story in the other sources? So if we have biographical data, and we can try to look at do this by looking at their family relationships, whom their father were, the places they were from, the dates, the period they lived in, and that is what we call disambiguation. It's actually that is the part. So that is the stage of the work that took most of our time. So, for example, when I'm dealing with these lists of prefectural governors, I try to identify the places they were from, to match the person to the correct record in China biographical database. That is taking a lot of time.
That would actually get into my next question, which was about the relational system you were using. It looked like there were long, and I was wondering if this was unique to your project or if this was a different system.
This one?
No, you have strings.
Oh,
like
the strings.
SH,
Okay, I see. Right.
Was that cumulative or was that?
It's recursive.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's recursive.
Yeah.
So for example, here, this person was mentioned. So we're looking at the Sun Mian here and Wang Zhi here and try to figure out if they are related to each other through marriage or agnatic ties.
Mm-hmm.
And we discovered there was a tie between them, but it goes through two other persons, in the way in which that the database is in the way in which these data points are registered in the database, right? So this person, so the Sun Mian's daughter's husband is Zhuang Gongyue, and his wife's father-in-law, so and so, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it goes through the database 1, 2, 3 times in order to capture this data, and this is the way that I set up my query.
Yeah.
In order to, so I define, for example, here, a person are related to each other. So if we think about who is a relative of whom, we have to define what a relative means. Is my father a relative of me? Is my father's cousin a relative? Is my father's cousin's wife? Is my father's cousin's wife's brother-in-law a relative? Should him or her considered a relative of me? Right. So in these cases, we have to define in concrete terms what we mean by kin or relative. And in my case, I look at people who are related to each other through one marriage or two marriages, right? So here, the daughter's husband, that will be one marriage, and the wife's father is another marriage, and the wife's father is another marriage. So it involves 3 marriages. I capture them, and then I calculate the degrees of marriage, and then I sort of reformat all my data. I can filter my data according to the rules I set up. So I first cast my net wide, and then filter down the records.
And what's Z?
What is this? Oh, Z means sister, because we have used this S for son, so we have to use a different sign for sister.
Okay.
Not on the record.
Okay. Then, thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Oops.